Awesome. We're going to continue this theme of brand safety with the next session. We and focus specifically on how GARM frameworks can be implemented along with other transparency standards like ads.txt, sellers.json. We've got a panel of folks here who think about this and deal with this day to day. Excited to introduce Chris Vargo, who's the Chief Executive Officer of socialcontext.ai. He'll be moderating the conversation. Joining Chris will be Lane Schechter, who's the Senior Product Manager at GumGum, Temi Zalai, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Medarka, and Alexis Sandler, the Associate Director of Global Digital Standards at PMX. I'll let you guys take it from here.
Sorry, you told us not to do that. But anyway, a wonderful presentation by Rich. And again, I also believe as a professor who teaches data science and all the different analytic approaches to NLP that supervised machine learning is absolutely a more precise way to involve humans in making decisions on whether content is included or not. So, along those lines, I think one of the big disconnections that I see, trying to translate these difficult concepts into into agencies so that they can understand it, is this idea between brand safety and brand suitability. So a colleague of mine, Ryan Spicer at CNN, he once told me, all of the content on CNN.com is unequivocally safe. The questions that marketers should evaluate is whether any specific content is suitable or not for their individual brand. Do you agree, Lane? Do you agree that all content on CNN.com is safe, or how would you go about tackling that from a perspective with what you're doing at GumGum?
Sure, and thanks for the question, Chris. Thank you, Alexis and Temi, for joining me on this panel today. I think to best answer this, first we need to establish the definition of brand safety we're adhering to. So in the context of GARM's safety floor and suitability framework, it's quite likely that the content of professional editorial sites is more than likely not going to violate or be in violation of the safety floor, but in fact more likely to be breaking news coverage or news features on a variety of subjects, including those that may be listed in the sensitive content categories. In this particular context, it's likely these topics that are covered by CNN in this example would fall into the medium or low risk levels of suitability, eliciting educational, informative, scientific, or breaking news purposes. So in summary, I suppose I'd agree. I do just want to add that as providers, we need to make sure we are doing our part in supporting this more nuanced effort. Ways in which we can do that is to make sure the tools available to marketers are able to intelligently make that distinction between a binary safety floor violation and truly understanding context, which is a requirement for suitability. So, I think a primary driver of why news content is so often overblocked and demonetized is because blunt force tools are being used as a solution that actually requires more surgical precision.
Couldn't agree more. Any other perspectives?
I could jump in from the buy side. Definitely agree. Publicis Media has taken a really strong position on supporting trusted news. With a property like CNN, it's definitely a question of suitability. I think we all know that news consumption has grown exponentially over the past few years, but unfortunately, advertisers are still avoiding news because we have brands that are wary of appearing alongside quote unquote hard news that they fear isn't brand safe. But the reality is that our research shows 90% of people respond favorably or neutrally to ads appearing next to hard news, even serious information like COVID-19. So it's really important to overturn the belief that news is not brand safe. And to Lane's point, one way we can accomplish that is with better suitability controls.
That's so great to hear. I really think that's so important. I'm going to jump on to the next question. I think we heard some mentions of some keywords that I think get us there. But taking us a step further, how would you verify or validate the performance of a brand safety or a brand suitability solution? A number of providers are making this effort, including Zephyr, to try and make their algorithms more precise. And I think precision is definitely part of this conversation. But how do we present this so that these solutions aren't just black boxes? That we go to advertisers and we say, hey, trust us, this works really great. I think that's something we need to do. Does anyone have any perspective on how we can go about taking these things from being black boxes to tools that advertisers can feel really confident that these tools are measuring not only precisely but accurately?
Sure, Chris, I'd be happy to jump in on that. And Rich gave us a nice, segue into this conversation, right? Some of the efforts that, Zephyr and the IAB Tech Lab are launching are kind of, cornerstones or foundations to this, because, in order to verify or validate anything, we have to have agreement about the behaviors and outputs that we expect from the system. Right? Let's just take a stupid example, right? Like if I want to confirm that my fridge is actually keeping food cold and I take its the temperature and it's between 35 and 40 degrees, I need to have an agreement that that's the range that's safe. And I need to understand whether that 35 or 40 degrees is Celsius or Fahrenheit, right? And the same is true in brand safety and suitability. Rich talked about the GARM framework and how it removes subjectivity from the equation. I'm a little less optimistic that the GARM framework has completely solved that problem. Maybe that's because I'm on the front lines of this and I see the disagreements that come up when people encounter the same piece of data and attempt to apply GARM labels to it. I think there's still a lot of ambiguity there. So I don't think that's a done deal. I think it's a great step in the right direction to getting us to shared definitions, which is really the cornerstone of all of this. And then, with the work that Zephyr and IAB Tech Lab are doing or starting, shared data points that we can use to calibrate against and provide benchmarks towards.
And I would agree with you. I think that everything is subjective at the end of the day, especially the context of an article. It's never going to be black and white in all cases, and in that kind of grayness of understanding that there is nuance is something that is probably never avoidable in reality, right?
It's not, and especially when we consider, we're looking at a global landscape, right, where there are different norms and standards across markets, right? We're looking at different cultural contexts that need to be taken into account. And suitability, actually means being right or acceptable for someone or something, right? So we need to expect some variability there, right? I don't think we can completely remove subjectivity from the equation of suitability. The question is, how can we come up with reasonable benchmarks and metrics and approaches to providing that transparency so that these systems are not a black box? It doesn't necessarily mean everybody's always going to get the same answer, but at least we know what answers they are getting and giving.
So well
Yeah,
said.
I just want to jump in real quick, if that's all right, and say how much I appreciate that and that answer and to what Zephyr has contributed as an open source project to establish a unified data set that can be used to measure suitability and safety services. And just to echo that, the importance of transparency. While there is no one metric in place that is universally agreed upon or even existing today to measure the effectiveness of a suitability service, really leaning into transparency even further and going as far as, if you can, making descriptions of methodology for how you are applying your practices to even identify instances of suitability is something, we at GumGum really, really feel strongly about, and, I continue to encourage anybody and everybody to really lean into.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about this process of agencies and determining risk level. So GARM lays out different risk levels with the assumption that advertisers will adopt the right ones for their brands. I'm kind of curious, how do you start that conversation with a brand? What guides you in setting those tolerances? If I'm an advertiser, why would I not just, set all of my risks to low, right? Isn't that what all of this technology is here to do, is just to avoid risk? What I personally obviously feel like that's not the right answer for journalism, but also for brands. But I was wondering, Alexis, maybe if you could shine a little bit more of a light on how you have that conversation with brands, and how you kind of talk about the pros and the cons associated with risk.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. So, starting with how do we start the conversations with our brands? We have already been talking to our clients about safety and suitability for years now. And now we're starting to shift that conversation to a new standard that we call brand integrity. So we know that part of what keeps marketers up at night is worrying about their ads appearing next to unsavory content, and that in times of uncertainty, brands are likely to pause or pull their advertising altogether. And instead of this short term approach to brand safety, we really want to help our clients rally around this brand integrity framework where brands are defining their key values, they're outlining their desired reputation and how they want to respond to culturally sensitive moments. And then we take that framework and help our clients confidently apply it to the correct GARM risk level. And then kind of moving on to how do we view more the trade-off there. I mean, at the end of the day, as a buyer, we want to find the target audience for our brand, and that target audience may not always be on low risk content. So, if you think about the different kind of target audience for an alcohol brand versus a baby product brand, for example. And then if you think about the fact that there are highly engaged audiences on content categorized as medium or even high risk, we want our advertisers to be making intelligent decisions, to be where their consumers are in a safe and suitable way that drives outcomes. And that's really what the GARM framework aims to accomplish. But again, to bring it all back around, the only way to know what type of content is suitable is to understand the brand's core values and their true brand integrity framework.
Any other perspectives? So I think
captured it quite nicely.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there is certainly pros and cons associated with risk. As a professor in a journalism school, it makes me sad when programmatic advertisers tell me that oh, when the news is negative, I'm just going to pause my ad spend. And I think that the update to IAB's taxonomy really is trying to decouple news from things like politics. To try to give advertisers those opportunities to contextually advertise on stuff that is positive, right? Because not all news is negative, and not all news is politics, even though it seems like that. I understand. So one of the categories that really grabbed my eye was educational content. Meanwhile, new categories like civic affairs have also been approached. So these are arguably, things that are good for society, right? Things that help, folks become more informed and also more aware of what's going on around them. So how does this fit into a broader contextual strategy? Will this new approach to news kind of help advertisers better advertise, on news content? If so, how's that going to work? I'm really fascinated with these enhancements to the IAB's 3.0, and I'm really curious to see if anyone has a perspective on how that might change how you talk to a brand or an advertiser about it.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. Go ahead, Tammy.
No, you go ahead, Alexis.
I mean, I was just going to kind of reiterate from earlier that our research does suggest that 90% of hard news from a trusted publisher is brand suitable, and we take that message to our advertisers. And I think the new taxonomy will empower smarter decisions based on how we've worked to address the nuance within news. It will give advertisers better choices to begin testing and dipping their toes into the water. But Tammy, would love to hear your work with the
Alexis,
there.
Yeah, Alexis, that's exactly it. We spent a lot of time on working on content taxonomy version 3.0, talking with both news publishers and the buy side about how can we approach this that will give more flexibility and control, right? And doing that meant, moving news out of the aboutness categories of the taxonomy, because news can really be about anything. Right. And lots of consumers engage with news, and not all news is negative. And so, the hope is, and, the intention is that this gives advertisers a lot more control, because they can now, decide to target specific topics, for example, unless maybe it's news, or decide to target specific topics specifically when it is news content. Right. And so it just gives everybody a lot more control, rather than the former approach, which was really a one-size-fits-all approach to news.
Agreed. And I think the devil, as we talked about earlier, is always in the measurement. And I do like the improvements to GARM. I think I'm a little bit more on the side of this stuff is still really hard to measure from a social science kind of just empirical measurement standard. I think these definitions are going to be really hard to get good agreement on. One of those categories in the low risk area is educational, informative, and scientific treatment of news, and pretty much all of these sensitive categories are low risk when it's educational, informative, and scientific. So that means that if an article is about gun control, but it is educational, informative, and scientific, then it's low risk. And I think that is actually a great way to look at safety and suitability. But my question is, how would you go about measuring that? How would you detect an article about gun control, but then also say, okay, yeah, this article about gun control is educational, informative, and scientific? That has the social scientist in me really intrigued, and I would love to hear if anyone has some thoughts on how you would execute that method.
Yeah, I would love to jump in on this real quick, because it is such an intriguing, I think, area of opportunity, and one specifically that, here at GumGum, we've taken an approach to continuing to leverage machine learning at scale. And in order to do that, to fit into this, to the guidelines and framework that GARM has put forth, it really starts with what Rich talked about earlier too, with this supervised machine learning process of collecting data that could be representative of this educational and informative, low risk sort of bucket, and having multiple human annotators review this content, come with multiple agreements before something potentially gets added into a training and testing set to ultimately train the model on, so that it can make those predictions when it sees similar typed content in the future that it hasn't previously been exposed to. What we do is try to make sure that we're using a very distributed workforce that don't know each other, that it's blinded. We will not just take one agreement. We make sure that there's multiple agreements, and we provide the definitions that GARM has set forth as the definition for what we're looking for educational content. That still, I think to Temi's point, doesn't remove subjectivity entirely from the equation. So it's a very difficult problem that we're constantly looking at and trying to continue to collect more and more data and get more and more annotations and inject the human aspect into the machine learning process to hopefully be able to identify these low risk areas with more consistency in the future.
Yeah, it's a continuous process. I agree, Lane. I mean, what the constant updating of algorithms, because what is informative, what is educational today will be different than what is educational and informative tomorrow. Really fits well into this supervised machine learning environment. Being able to constantly update your models. I agree. I think it's the only way you can go about even beginning to solve a problem like that. Any other perspectives? Okay, well let's close with the big one, the one that I really wanted to answer today. So how do I want to know that, because I'm a little bit away from all of the different approaches that you could take to brand safety, and there are a broad number of solutions. There are folks out there like DeepSea that are looking at publisher level behaviors and actually like domain level behaviors. There are folks looking at the text content of news sites. There are people that are looking at the ways in which advertising IDs and Google Analytics IDs are tied to each other. But how do you go about fighting misinformation, disinformation, and made for advertising sites? Are brand safety tools alone enough to prevent this stuff from being monetized? And how do we go about protecting advertisers from these environments?
I'm going to jump in real quick, if that's all right with you and the rest of the panel here. First and foremost, from the GumGum perspective with our contextual brand safety and brand suitability tool, Verity, our objective as a contextual safety and suitability service is to identify the presence of topics in alignment with the industry adopted definitions, making that information available for marketers and publishers alike to begin thinking in terms of suitability or brand integrity. That being said, when we look at this, I think we as an industry still need to do more to tackle the issue of misinformation, disinformation together and establish more of an industry-wide guidelines or guardrails. It's a really sensitive topic in a content category that quite literally has debated in its title. So yeah, it's a really great question, and one that we need to spend a lot more time, I think, as an industry coming together and deciding how do we really define this category further.
Lane,
Yeah,
I absolutely.
Temi and Lane, I agree. I think at the end of the day, there are companies out there that are focused purely on solving this issue, right? You have companies like a GDI, like a NewsGuard. So our platforms, our partners need to continuing partnering with companies that are experts in this area. And I would say brand safety tools are not enough. They're never enough, right? It's all about collaboration. You need the news entities, the agencies, the partners, clients, vendors to continue working together to create solutions that can be used holistically.
Alexis, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there are experts out there who focus on nothing but misinformation and disinformation, and the industry really needs to lean into that. And I agree. I don't think brand safety vendors and ad verification alone are enough. These are really, really hard problems.
That's a great place to end. Thank you all for participating in this panel. It was a true pleasure hearing your perspectives.